Blood trickled down Terrence Jackson's face as security dragged him through first class. Passengers recorded, whispering, "Troublemaker." He reached into his jacket. The guard twisted his arm until Terrence's FBI badge clattered to the floor. Everyone froze. This nightmare had just begun. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination while traveling, and subscribe to follow Terrence's incredible journey for justice. How would you react if you saw someone being unfairly treated on a flight? Let's find out what happens next in this unbelievable true story. Terrence Jackson had dedicated 15 years of his life to the FBI. At 42, he had become one of the Bureau's most decorated counterterrorism agents, known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to justice. His colleagues respected him, and his superiors trusted him with the most sensitive cases. But today, Terrence wasn't thinking about national security threats or ongoing investigations. His mind was clouded with grief. The past week had been emotionally draining. His mother, Eleanor Jackson, had passed away after a long battle with cancer. The funeral in Atlanta had brought together family members from across the country, all sharing stories of the strong, compassionate woman who had raised Terrence to stand tall in a world that often tried to diminish him. "You remember what I always told you," his father William had said at the repast, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your mother believed that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered." Those words echoed in Terrence's mind as he rushed through Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. His flight back to Washington, D.C. had been scheduled deliberately tight. He needed to return for a critical briefing on a case that couldn't wait, even for grief. The team depended on him. Checking his watch, Terrence calculated he had barely enough time to make it through security and to his gate. He had splurged on a first-class ticket, something he rarely did, but today he needed the comfort. It wasn't bureau money, he had paid the difference himself, a small tribute to his mother who always told him to take care of himself when times got tough. Last call for boarding, Flight 1327 to Washington, D.C., the announcement blared as Terrence finally reached the gate, slightly out of breath. The gate agent, a young man with a friendly smile, quickly scanned his boarding pass. "Just in time, sir. Have a good flight." Terrence nodded appreciatively and made his way down the jet bridge. As he stepped onto the plane, the first flight attendant, Melissa Weber, a blonde woman in her 30s, was greeting passengers with practiced warmth. "Welcome aboard," she said to the elderly couple ahead of Terrence, her smile reaching her eyes. When Terrence approached, something subtle shifted in her expression. The smile remained, but her eyes flickered with something else. Suspicion, perhaps, or discomfort. "Boarding pass?" she asked, her tone noticeably cooler. Terrence handed it to her without comment, used to these small, painful moments of different treatment. 7A, she said, barely making eye contact. "On your left." Terrence made his way to his seat, aware of the eyes following him. First class wasn't typically diverse on these routes, and he could feel the unasked questions in the glances. What is he doing here? Is he in the right section? His seat was by the window, and the aisle seat was still empty. Terrence stored his carry-on and settled in, closing his eyes momentarily. The weight of the funeral, the rushed journey, and the anticipation of returning to work created a heaviness that pressed against his chest. He was interrupted by the arrival of his seatmate, a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit. Calvin Porter, as Terrence would later learn, was a senior investment banker with a corner office and the confidence that came with never having his belonging questioned. Porter looked at Terrence, then at his own boarding pass, then back at Terrence. Without a word, he pressed the call button. Melissa appeared almost immediately. "How can I help you, sir? Is there another seat available in first class?" Porter asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "I'd prefer a different arrangement." Terrence kept his eyes forward, his face impassive, but his jaw tightened slightly. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have a full flight today," Melissa responded, though Terrence noticed she seemed understanding of the request. I can't move you to another first-class seat. Porter sighed dramatically. Fine. It seems the upgrading standards aren't what they used to be. The comment hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. Terrence continued looking straight ahead, his mother's words repeating in his mind. Dignity can't be taken, only surrendered. Porter reluctantly took his seat, creating as much distance between himself and Terrence as the limited space allowed. He pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, his body language screaming discomfort. Terrence tried to close his eyes again, hoping to catch a few minutes of sleep before takeoff, but he became increasingly aware of whispered conversations. Opening his eyes slightly, he noticed Melissa conferring with another flight attendant further down the aisle, both occasionally glancing in his direction. It wasn't an unfamiliar situation. Throughout his career, Terrence had faced similar moments of profiling, even when wearing his FBI windbreaker or displaying credentials. There was the time he was stopped by security while entering the FBI headquarters through the employee entrance, despite showing his badge. Or when he was conducting an interview at a high-end hotel, and a guest reported a suspicious man asking questions. Each incident was a reminder that in some eyes, his skin color overrode his authority, his credentials, and his humanity. As the boarding process continued, Terrence decided to make a quick call to his partner, Agent Sarah Rodriguez. They had worked together for 7 years, developing the kind of trust and understanding that made them one of the most effective teams in their division. Sarah, it's Terrence, he said when she answered. Just checking if there have been any developments on the Highland case. Terrence, I'm so sorry about your mom, Sarah responded first, her voice warm with genuine concern. How are you holding up? Managing, he said simply. The family is strong. But I need to focus on work now. I understand, she replied. The briefing is still scheduled for 4. We've got some new intel from the Norfolk office that looks promising. How's your flight? About to take off, Terrence said. Should land around 2, which gives me enough time to get to the office. Perfect. And Terrence, she added, take care of yourself, okay? We've got this covered if you need more time. Appreciate it, but I'll be there, he assured her. See you at 4. As he ended the call, Terrence didn't notice Melissa Weber watching him with narrowed eyes, her suspicions growing with every word of his conversation. Sir, you need to turn that off immediately. Melissa's voice cut through the ambient noise of the cabin, sharp and commanding. She stood over Terrence, her posture rigid. Terrence looked up, momentarily confused by her tone. He had just ended his call with Sarah and was about to switch his phone to airplane mode. I was just finishing a work call, he explained calmly, his finger already moving to the power button. I'm turning it off now. The captain has called for all electronic devices to be powered down, Melissa insisted, despite the fact that several other passengers in first class, including Porter, were still openly using their phones. Yes, ma'am, Terrence replied, keeping his voice level as he held up his now darkened screen to show compliance. It's off. She stared at him for a moment longer than necessary before moving away without acknowledgement. Terrence exhaled slowly, conscious of Porter's smirk beside him. The plane pushed back from the gate, and the safety demonstration began. Just as they were taxiing toward the runway, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'm afraid we've been notified of some congestion on our departure route. We're currently looking at a 30-minute delay before takeoff. I'll keep you updated on any changes. Flight attendants, prepare for a short delay. Collective groans rose from the cabin. Porter immediately retrieved his phone and began making calls, complaining loudly about the inconvenience to someone named Margaret, presumably his assistant. Terrence considered his options. The delay meant he would be cutting it even closer for the briefing. He needed to let Sarah know about the potential schedule change. After observing that nearly everyone around him, including Porter, had reactivated their devices, he carefully took out his phone to send a quick text. He had barely typed 2 words when Melissa returned, this time with an older man wearing a senior flight attendant's uniform with a name tag reading, Douglas Freeman. "Sir," Douglas addressed Terrence with exaggerated patience, "I understand you're having difficulty following crew member instructions about electronic devices." Terrence blinked in surprise. "There's been a misunderstanding." The captain announced a delay, and like other passengers, he gestured discreetly around the cabin where numerous phones were visible. "I was sending a quick work message about the schedule change." "Sir, when a flight attendant gives you an instruction, it's not optional," Douglas continued, ignoring Terrence's explanation and the obvious double standard. "It's a federal requirement to comply." "I'm aware of federal aviation regulations," Terrence replied evenly. "I work for the FBI and was contacting my team about an urgent case briefing I might miss due to this delay." Douglas exchanged a skeptical glance with Melissa. "Do you have identification to verify that claim?" "Yes, in my bag overhead," Terrence answered, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'd be happy to show you." Before he could stand, Porter interjected loudly, "He's been behaving suspiciously this entire time. Making cryptic calls about intel and briefings and watching everyone. I don't feel safe." The accusation hung in the air. Terrence noticed other passengers turning to look, some already holding up phones, recording the interaction. The situation was escalating from minor inconvenience to potential disaster. "Sir, please remain seated," Douglas ordered, his hand raised as if to physically prevent Terrence from standing. "I'm simply trying to access my credentials," Terrence explained, his voice still calm but firmer now. "I'm a federal agent, and I need to reach my identification in my bag." "You should have identified yourself earlier if that's the case," Melissa added, her arms crossed defensively. "I didn't realize I needed to announce my profession upon boarding," Terrence replied. "But I'm telling you now, and I'd like to show you my badge." Porter scoffed loudly. "Anyone can claim to be FBI. He could be making it up to intimidate us." More passengers were watching now, murmuring among themselves. Someone a few rows back said something about behavior these days, just loud enough for Terrence to hear. "Sir, if you continue to be disruptive, we'll need to involve security," Douglas warned. "Disruptive?" Terrence questioned, maintaining his composure despite the growing injustice of the situation. "I haven't raised my voice or refused any reasonable request. I'm simply trying to identify myself as a federal agent." "You've repeatedly failed to comply with crew instructions," Douglas insisted, the fabrication so blatant that Terrence nearly lost his carefully maintained composure. "That's not true," Terrence stated firmly. "I turned off my phone when asked, despite others continuing to use theirs. I've remained calm and respectful throughout this interaction. I'm asking for the opportunity to show my credentials." "He's becoming aggressive," Porter announced to the cabin at large, as if narrating for the benefit of the recording phones. "Listen to his tone." Douglas nodded to Melissa, who moved quickly toward a phone at the front of the cabin. "I'm calling security," she announced. Terrence closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. This was spiraling out of control, and he knew from bitter experience and professional training that his next actions were critical. If he showed any reaction that could be construed as threatening, the situation would only worsen. "I understand," he said carefully when he opened his eyes. "But I want the record to show that I have been cooperative, that I've offered to provide federal identification, and that I'm being treated differently from other passengers on this flight." The cabin grew quiet as passengers absorbed his words, some looking uncomfortably at their own phones still in use. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The first, a burly white man with a crew cut whose badge identified him as Brady Wilson, strode down the aisle with an air of preemptive authority. Behind him, a younger Hispanic officer, Victor Ramirez, followed with a more measured expression. "What seems to be the problem?" Wilson asked, addressing Douglas rather than Terrence. Douglas gestured toward Terrence. This passenger has been non-compliant with crew member instructions and became confrontational when addressed about it. That's not accurate, Terrence interjected calmly. I've been fully cooperative and have repeatedly offered to show my FBI credentials, which are in my overhead bag. Wilson's expression hardened at Terrence's response. Sir, when airline staff call security, it means the situation has already passed the point of discussion. Ramirez, observing the scene more carefully, noticed the numerous passengers still using phones, the recording devices pointed at Terrence, and Porter's smug expression. His brow furrowed slightly as he recognized the familiar patterns of a situation where bias, not behavior, was driving events. Maybe we should verify his claim about being FBI, Ramirez suggested quietly to Wilson. If he has identification, we'll sort all that out once he's off the aircraft, Wilson cut him off. Sir, I need you to gather your belongings and come with us. Officer Wilson, Terrence addressed him directly, reading his name badge, I'm Special Agent Terrence Jackson with the FBI Counterterrorism Division. I'm returning from a family funeral to a critical case briefing. This appears to be a misunderstanding that we can resolve quickly if you allow me to access my credentials. He's been making suspicious calls about some sort of operation, Porter volunteered, raising his voice to be heard clearly on the recordings. Talking about intel and watching everyone. Several passengers nodded in agreement, the narrative already taking hold despite having no basis in reality. I was speaking to my FBI partner about a case briefing, Terrence clarified, his patience wearing thin but his voice remaining steady. A completely normal work conversation. Sir, last chance, Wilson stated firmly. Come with us voluntarily, or we'll have to remove you. Terrence realized he had run out of options for reasonable resolution. I understand you're doing your job, Officer Wilson, but I want to be clear that I'm being cooperative while under protest. This is discriminatory treatment, and I intend to file a formal complaint. He unbuckled his seatbelt and began to stand, intending to reach for his overhead bag containing his credentials. Keep your hands where I can see them, Wilson barked, suddenly reaching for Terrence's arm. You don't need to get anything. My federal identification is in my bag, Terrence insisted, freezing in place to avoid any movement that could be misinterpreted. I have the right to identify myself. You'll have plenty of time for that once we're off the aircraft, Wilson replied, his grip tightening on Terrence's arm. Ramirez shifted uncomfortably, increasingly certain they were making a mistake. Brady, maybe we should follow procedure, Wilson finished for him firmly. Sir, you need to come with us now. The situation had reached a critical point. Terrence knew that further resistance would only escalate matters, but being removed from the flight would mean missing his briefing and potentially damaging his reputation within the Bureau. More importantly, it would mean surrendering the dignity his mother had taught him to protect. But she had also taught him to choose his battles wisely. Sometimes, vindication required patience. I'll come with you, Terrence finally said, but I want it noted that I've been cooperative throughout and have repeatedly tried to identify myself as a federal agent. As Wilson began to lead him toward the exit, Terrence could feel the weight of dozens of stares, some sympathetic, others judgmental, and many simply recording the spectacle for social media. The humiliation burned, but he held his head high. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The grip on Terrence's arm tightened as Officer Wilson led him forward. The pressure was unnecessary, painful even, since Terrence was complying fully with the order to leave the aircraft. But Wilson seemed determined to assert physical dominance in a situation that required none. There's no need for that, Terrence said quietly, referring to the excessive force. I'm cooperating. Stop resisting, Wilson responded loudly, though Terrence had shown no resistance whatsoever. The performance wasn't for Terrence, it was for the audience of passengers, many still recording with their phones. Wilson was creating a narrative, the dangerous passenger requiring forceful handling, regardless of the reality. As they reached the front of the first-class cabin, Terrence tried once more to resolve the situation reasonably. Officer Wilson, before we exit the aircraft, Could you allow me to retrieve my FBI credentials from my bag? It would clear this up immediately. You can save the FBI story for later, Wilson replied dismissively. I've heard it all before. Officer Ramirez, trailing behind, interjected cautiously. It wouldn't hurt to check his ID, Wilson. If he's telling the truth, we follow protocol, Wilson cut him off sharply. Remove the passenger, then verify claims away from the aircraft. From the back of the plane, a passenger shouted, he was making threats. It was a complete fabrication, but in the charged atmosphere, several people nodded in agreement, the false narrative gaining momentum. Porter, still seated but leaning into the aisle to maintain his central role in the drama, added, he was talking about some kind of operation happening today. I heard him. These baseless accusations turned a routine removal into something more urgent and potentially dangerous in the eyes of the security officers and watching passengers. Terrence could feel the situation slipping further beyond reason, the presumption of threat overriding any possibility of measured response. That's absolutely false, Terrence stated firmly, still maintaining his composure despite the escalating injustice. I made no threats, implied or otherwise. I was discussing a work meeting with a colleague. Wilson responded by jerking Terrence's arm upward in a pain compliance hold, causing him to wince involuntarily. I said stop resisting. I'm not resisting, Terrence replied through gritted teeth, the pain shooting through his shoulder. Ramirez watched with growing concern. His training and experience told him this situation was being mishandled, that the passenger, regardless of whether he was actually FBI, was being treated with excessive force despite showing no resistance. But challenging a senior officer in front of civilians would create its own problems. Wilson, he said quietly, he's complying. Maybe we should ease up a bit. The suggestion seemed to irritate Wilson further. As they reached the door of the aircraft, he suddenly accelerated, shoving Terrence forward with unnecessary force. Terrence, caught off guard by the aggressive movement, stumbled slightly. Wilson seized on this momentary imbalance, using it as pretense to escalate to a takedown maneuver. He drove Terrence forward against the bulkhead wall, the impact causing a small cut to open above Terrence's eyebrow. Blood began to trickle down the side of his face as Wilson wrenched his arms behind his back. The sudden violence shocked the cabin into silence, the only sounds being the clicks of phone cameras capturing the moment. This is completely unnecessary, Terrence stated, his voice still controlled despite the pain and humiliation. I am Special Agent Terrence Jackson, FBI. Sure you are, Wilson replied sarcastically, pressing Terrence's face against the wall. In that moment, with blood trickling down his face and his professional identity being mockingly dismissed, something in Terrence shifted. This was no longer just about making his flight or avoiding inconvenience. This was about standing up against the kind of injustice he had dedicated his career to fighting. My badge is in my inner jacket pocket, he stated with quiet determination. I'm going to reach for it very slowly. Don't you move, Wilson warned, but Terrence had already begun a careful, deliberate movement with his right hand toward the inside of his suit jacket. Have you ever been in a situation where someone refused to believe who you truly were? Comment number 1 if you think Officer Wilson should have checked Terrence's ID right away, or number 2 if you believe security was just doing their job. Don't forget to like and subscribe to see how this shocking confrontation ends. The next moment will change everything for everyone involved. What do you think will happen when Terrence's true identity is revealed? Wilson, interpreting the movement as resistance rather than identification, reacted with immediate and excessive force. He violently twisted Terrence's arm, causing a sharp pain to shoot through his shoulder and eliciting an involuntary gasp. In the struggle, Terrence's hand managed to partially reach inside his jacket, fingers brushing against the leather case containing his badge. As Wilson yanked his arm back with unnecessary force, the badge case dislodged from Terrence's inner pocket. Time seemed to slow as the gold FBI shield tumbled through the air, catching the cabin lights as it spun. It landed on the floor with a distinctive metallic clatter, the official credentials partially opened to reveal Terrence's photo ID alongside the unmistakable emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent cabin. It was as if someone had pressed pause on the entire scene. Wilson's grip loosened in shock, Ramirez took an instinctive step back, and passengers throughout the cabin collectively gasped. Melissa's hand flew to her mouth. Douglas froze mid-stride as he approached to check on the situation. Even Porter, who had been so vocal in his accusations, seemed to shrink in his seat as the reality of his actions began to dawn on him. The badge lay on the floor between them, irrefutable evidence that everything Terrence had been claiming was true. He was indeed a federal agent, and everything that had transpired in the last 20 minutes had been a catastrophic error fueled by bias and assumption. Wilson's face drained of color as he stared at the badge, the realization of his serious professional misjudgment sinking in. This wasn't just a difficult passenger he could rough up with impunity, this was an FBI agent he had just assaulted while performing his duties. Ramirez was the first to move, bending down to carefully retrieve the badge. He examined it briefly, confirming its authenticity, before addressing Terrence with newfound respect. "I apologize, Special Agent Jackson," he said, his voice sincere and professional. "May I help you up, sir?" The "sir" hung in the air, a stark contrast to the treatment Terrence had received moments earlier. The transformation was immediate and telling, proof, if any were needed, that the previous treatment had nothing to do with his behavior and everything to do with perceptions based on his race. Terrence straightened himself, adjusting his suit jacket with as much dignity as he could muster despite the blood still trickling down his face. He extended his hand for his badge, which Ramirez returned promptly. "Thank you, Officer Ramirez," Terrence replied, noting the younger officer's name badge. His voice remained steady and professional, despite the humiliation and physical pain he had just endured. Wilson seemed frozen in place, his face a mixture of shock and growing dread as the professional implications of his actions began to sink in. "I tried to tell you," Terrence said simply, looking directly at Wilson. There was no satisfaction in the moment, only a weary recognition of a pattern repeated too many times throughout his life and career. The captain had emerged from the cockpit, alerted by the commotion. "What's happening here?" he asked, taking in the blood on Terrence's face and the badge now in his hand. "A significant error in judgment," Terrence replied calmly. "I'm Special Agent Terrence Jackson, FBI. I was attempting to identify myself when Officer Wilson here decided physical force was more appropriate than verification." The captain's expression shifted from concern to alarm as he processed this information. "Agent Jackson, I'm Captain Richard Bennett. I had no idea. Please accept my deepest apologies for how you've been treated on my aircraft. The responsibility isn't entirely yours, Captain Bennett," Terrence replied. "But I would like to understand why your crew singled me out for enforcement of phone usage when nearly every passenger in first class was using their devices after the delay announcement." Captain Bennett turned to Douglas and Melissa, who both seemed at a loss for words, the discriminatory nature of their actions now painfully obvious to everyone watching. There was a misunderstanding," Douglas finally stammered, his earlier authority evaporated. "A passenger expressed concerns." "That passenger," Terrence interrupted, pointing to Porter who was now studying his shoes intently, "made assumptions based entirely on my appearance, and your crew chose to validate those assumptions rather than evaluate the situation objectively." The truth of this statement hung heavily in the cabin. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity and remaining silent while witnessing discriminatory treatment. Wilson, finally finding his voice, attempted damage control. "Agent Jackson, there was no way for me to know, there was every way for you to know," Terrence corrected him firmly. "I stated my identity clearly and repeatedly. I asked to show you my credentials multiple times. You chose not to listen or verify, and instead escalated to physical force against a compliant individual. That's not procedure, that's prejudice." Ramirez nodded almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the truth in Terrence's assessment. As the reality of the situation settled over the cabin, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Airline staff who had been dismissive minutes earlier now approached with solicitous concern. Passengers who had been recording with hostility were now capturing the aftermath with very different intentions. "Agent Jackson, please let us get you some first aid for that cut," Melissa offered, her previous suspicion replaced with mortification. "Is there anything you need, sir?" Douglas added, his tone now deferential. The transformation was telling, respect offered freely now that his status was confirmed, though it had been withheld when he was simply a human being deserving of basic dignity. Terrence touched the cut above his eyebrow, his fingers coming away with blood. The physical wound was minor, but it was visible evidence of the much deeper injury inflicted by the systemic biases that had led to this moment. "What I need," Terrence replied, his voice carrying throughout the now silent cabin, "is accountability." The word accountability seemed to echo in the cabin, creating a palpable tension that replaced the previous chaos. Terrence stood tall, blood still trickling from the cut above his eyebrow, his FBI badge now clearly visible in his hand. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, but Terrence took no pleasure in it. This wasn't about revenge or humiliation, it was about justice and correction. Wilson, the security officer who had been so aggressive moments earlier, now shifted uncomfortably. "Agent Jackson, there appears to have been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Terrence interrupted firmly. "What happened here was textbook racial profiling, followed by excessive force against a compliant individual who repeatedly identified himself as a federal agent." Ramirez, the younger security officer, stepped forward. "Sir, I want to personally apologize. I recognized something wasn't right about this situation, but I didn't intervene strongly enough." Terrence acknowledged Ramirez's apology with a nod. At least one person involved was showing genuine accountability. "I appreciate that, Officer Ramirez." Captain Bennett gestured toward the cut on Terrence's face. "Agent Jackson, please allow us to provide first aid." "We have a medical kit, thank you, but that won't be necessary right now," Terrence replied, taking out his handkerchief to dab at the blood. His priority now was controlling the situation and ensuring appropriate consequences, not accepting symbolic gestures of care after the fact. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone, scrolling through his contacts before finding the name he needed. The cabin remained eerily quiet as he placed the call, everyone watching with bated breath. "Director Bennett? This is Special Agent Jackson," he said when the call connected. "I apologize for the interruption, but I'm currently experiencing a situation that requires your attention." Terrence proceeded to explain the events concisely and professionally, detailing the discriminatory treatment, the refusal to verify his credentials, and the eventual use of force that resulted in injury. Throughout the cabin, faces paled as the reality of what had transpired, and who they were dealing with, sank in. "Yes, ma'am," Terrence continued. "I'm still on the aircraft. No, I'm not seriously injured, but this incident raises significant concerns about profiling and use of force protocols." "Yes, I'll hold." While on hold, Terrence turned his attention back to the cabin. Porter, who had been instrumental in escalating the situation with his false claims, was attempting to gather his belongings quietly, clearly hoping to exit before facing consequences. "Mr. Porter," Terrence called out, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent cabin. "I need you to remain seated, please. Your role in these events will need to be documented." Porter froze, then slowly sank back into his seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. Melissa approached with a first aid kit, her previous suspicion replaced with obvious remorse. "Agent Jackson, please, at least let me offer you a bandage and some antiseptic for that cut." Terrence considered for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." As Melissa carefully applied antiseptic to the cut, Terrence returned to his call with Director Bennett. "Yes, ma'am, I'm still here." "I understand." "Yes, that would be appropriate." After concluding the call, Terrence addressed Captain Bennett. "Director Bennett has contacted the airline's executive team. She's also dispatching FBI Assistant Director Mitchell to meet the flight upon arrival in Washington. In the meantime, she's requested that all involved parties remain on board until appropriate statements can be taken. Captain Bennett nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Of course, Agent Jackson. Whatever you need. I don't want to further inconvenience the other passengers, Terrence added. How long is our current delay expected to be? Air traffic control estimates another 15 minutes before our departure slot, the captain replied. Then I suggest we proceed with the flight as scheduled, Terrence said. Officer Wilson, Officer Ramirez, Ms. Weber, Mr. Freeman, and Mr. Porter will need to remain available for questioning upon arrival. The named individuals nodded in somber agreement, the reality of their situation now impossible to ignore. Captain Bennett turned to address the rest of the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay and the disturbance. We will be departing shortly. I ask for your patience and understanding as we resolve this matter. A murmur rose from the cabin as passengers processed what they had witnessed. The sentiment had shifted dramatically, many who had been quick to assume Terrence was a troublemaker now looked embarrassed or ashamed. Others appeared outraged on his behalf, now that his identity had been confirmed. Terrence noticed this shift with a mixture of vindication and weariness. Why did it take an FBI badge to make people see the injustice? Would the same outrage exist if he had been just an ordinary black man being mistreated? The announcement came that the plane was cleared for departure. As the engines powered up and the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, Terrence returned to his seat, the same seat he had been violently removed from minutes earlier. Porter, still beside him but now visibly uncomfortable, attempted an awkward apology. Agent Jackson, I want to explain, save it for your formal statement, Mr. Porter, Terrence interrupted coolly. I'm not interested in private apologies for public humiliation. The flight attendants performed their safety demonstration with notable discomfort, especially when passing Terrence's row. The standard announcement about following crew member instructions carried a particular irony that wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the preceding events. As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the air, Terrence gazed out the window at Atlanta receding below them. His mother had been laid to rest here just yesterday, and he had promised her grave that he would continue fighting for the justice she had always believed in. Little did he know how soon that promise would be tested. Once they reached cruising altitude, the captain made another announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Bennett again. I want to personally apologize for the events that occurred prior to our departure. Rest assured that a full investigation will be conducted, and appropriate actions will be taken. In the meantime, our crew will do everything possible to make the remainder of your flight comfortable. The message was clearly directed at damage control, but Terrence appreciated the public acknowledgement nonetheless. Accountability began with recognition of wrongdoing. Melissa approached his seat with visible trepidation. Agent Jackson, can I offer you anything? A drink, perhaps, or something to eat? Water would be fine, thank you, Terrence replied professionally. As she hurried away to fulfill his simple request, Terrence noticed how the other flight attendants now went out of their way to address him with exaggerated courtesy. The same staff who had ignored his reasonable explanations earlier were now falling over themselves to demonstrate respect. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Rodriguez. Terrence, your incident is already hitting social media. Director Bennett briefed us. Are you okay? Do you need backup on arrival? He typed a quick response, I'm fine. AD Mitchell meeting flight. Proceed with briefing prep, I'll be there. Another message from Sarah arrived almost immediately, entire team has your back. This is outrageous. See you soon. The support warmed him, a reminder that while some systems remained deeply flawed, there were still people of integrity within them fighting for change. As Terrence settled in for the remainder of the flight, he was acutely aware of the stares from other passengers, some curious, some embarrassed, some supportive. The incident had transformed him from an anonymous traveler to the center of attention, a role he had never sought or desired. But perhaps, he reflected, this very public incident could serve a purpose beyond his personal vindication. Perhaps it could force a conversation about the biases that remained entrenched in everyday interactions, the assumptions that led to different treatment based on appearance rather than behavior. That would be accountability with meaning, not just consequences for individuals, but examination of the systemic issues that enabled such incidents to occur repeatedly. If his humiliation could contribute to that change, then perhaps some good could come from this disturbing experience. With that thought, Terrence closed his eyes, mentally preparing for the complexities that awaited him in Washington, both the terrorism case that had called him back early from his bereavement and the new battle for justice that had unexpectedly thrust itself into his path. His mother's words echoed once more in his mind, "Dignity can't be taken, only surrendered." Today, despite everything, he had not surrendered his. The airplane hummed at cruising altitude, the white noise of engines providing a backdrop to the tense atmosphere that permeated the cabin. Terrence sat straight in his seat, outwardly composed despite the dull throb from the cut above his eyebrow and the lingering ache in his shoulder where Wilson had wrenched his arm. He could feel the stares, some furtive, others more open, from passengers throughout the first-class cabin and beyond. The incident had transformed him from an anonymous traveler into an unwilling spectacle. Phones still occasionally aimed in his direction, capturing images or video of the FBI agent who had been profiled, disbelieved, and physically assaulted before his credentials were finally acknowledged. Closing his eyes briefly, Terrence found himself transported back to a summer day nearly 30 years earlier. He was 12 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of his father's car. William Jackson, a 20-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, had been pulled over while driving through an affluent neighborhood. "Watch carefully, son," his father had said quietly as the officer approached. "Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully but with dignity. Remember who you are, regardless of how they treat you." Young Terrence had observed as his father, a respected detective wearing a suit and tie, was questioned about what he was doing in that neighborhood, asked to provide not just his license but additional identification, and told to remain in the vehicle while the officer ran an unnecessary check on a fellow law enforcement officer. "Why didn't you tell him you're a police detective right away?" Terrence had asked afterward. His father's answer had shaped much of Terrence's approach to similar situations throughout his life. "Because my badge shouldn't be the only reason I'm treated with basic respect. And because sometimes, son, letting people reveal their assumptions teaches you what you need to know about them." The memory dissolved as Terrence opened his eyes, finding himself back in the pressurized cabin with its recycled air and underlying tension. The lesson from his father had served him well in many ways, but it carried its own burden. The exhaustion of constantly navigating spaces where your belonging was questioned, where your credentials were doubted simply because of how you looked. Another memory surfaced, his first day at FBI headquarters after completing training at Quantico. Despite wearing a freshly pressed suit and his new credentials, he had been stopped by security at the employee entrance. "Deliveries go through the back," the guard had said without looking up. "I'm not delivering anything," Terrence had replied calmly. "I'm reporting for my first day. Special Agent Terrence Jackson." The guard had looked up then, surprise poorly concealed as he examined Terrence's credentials with unnecessary thoroughness. "Can't be too careful these days," the guard had muttered by way of non-apology. Terrence had nodded politely and proceeded inside, where he soon met Sarah Rodriguez, who would become his partner and closest ally in the bureau. Sarah, a brilliant analyst who had worked her way up from the forensic linguistics department, understood something of Terrence's experience as a Latina woman in the predominantly white, male FBI. "They assumed I was a translator my first year," she had told him during one late-night stakeout. "Kept sending me documents in Spanish even though my specialization was in threat assessment patterns." Their shared experiences with assumptions and stereotyping had formed part of the foundation of their professional partnership, a mutual understanding that excellence had to be their minimum standard, that they would always be judged more harshly than their peers. A voice interrupted Terrence's reflections. "Excuse me, Agent Jackson." Terrence turned to find Porter, his seatmate and one of the primary instigators of the earlier incident, attempting an awkward conversation. "I just wanted to say, there were no hard feelings, right? A simple misunderstanding that got out of hand." The audacity of the statement momentarily robbed Terrence of words. No hard feelings. After Porter had falsely claimed he was making threats, had demanded a seat change based solely on Terrence's appearance, had contributed directly to the escalation that led to Terrence being physically assaulted? Terrence studied Porter's face, noting the nervousness behind the forced casual smile. This wasn't genuine remorse, this was damage control. Porter had realized he was potentially facing serious consequences, and was attempting to minimize the situation. "Mr. Porter," Terrence replied evenly, "what occurred wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a series of deliberate choices, your choice to assume the worst about me based on my appearance, the crew's choice to apply rules selectively, and security's choice to use force rather than verification. Those choices had consequences, including physical injury and public humiliation. So no, there are very much hard feelings, and there will be a full accounting of everyone's actions today." Porter's smile faltered, replaced by a poorly concealed panic. "Look, I was just concerned about some things I overheard." "Anyone would have. You claimed I made threats," Terrence interrupted, his voice low but firm. "That was a fabrication, not a misinterpretation. I suggest you save your explanations for your formal statement." Porter fell silent, turning away to stare fixedly at the seat back in front of him. Terrence's phone buzzed with incoming messages. News of the incident was spreading rapidly through bureau channels. Multiple colleagues had sent messages of support, outrage, and offers of assistance. Even Deputy Director Russell had weighed in with a brief but meaningful, "This is unacceptable. Full support for whatever action you deem appropriate." Most touching was a message from the newest black agent in their division, Alicia Bennett, "Agent Jackson, you've been a mentor to many of us. What happened to you today is why your guidance matters so much. We stand with you." The messages reinforced what Terrence already knew, that this incident wasn't just about him. It represented a pattern experienced by countless others who lacked the protection of a federal badge, whose stories weren't captured on viral videos, whose dignity was violated without consequence. A notification alerted him that the videos of his removal from the plane were already circulating widely on social media. Hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #FBI Profiled were trending. The airline's social media accounts were being flooded with outraged comments. Terrence had never sought the spotlight. His work in counterterrorism had always been behind the scenes, methodical and meticulous. The irony wasn't lost on him that his most public moment had nothing to do with the cases he had solved or the threats he had neutralized, but rather with being a victim of the very kind of prejudice he had worked to overcome throughout his career. As the flight continued toward Washington, Terrence turned his attention to the case files he had brought with him. The Highland investigation involved domestic terrorism with white supremacist connections, groups that exploited fear and division, that thrived on exactly the kind of racial animus he had experienced today. The parallels were not lost on him as he reviewed the intelligence about targeted violence against minority communities. The same dehumanization that allowed Porter to view him as inherently suspicious, that permitted Wilson to use excessive force without hesitation, fueled the extremism that threatened American communities. Melissa approached again, her demeanor transformed from the suspicious hostility of earlier to exaggerated deference. "Agent Jackson, can I get you anything else? Perhaps a pillow or blanket? Some food, maybe?" "No thank you," Terrence replied politely but firmly. "I'm fine." Her overcorrection was almost as uncomfortable as her earlier discrimination. Both responses were based on perception rather than treating him as an individual deserving of basic respect regardless of title. As Washington appeared on the horizon, Terrence prepared himself for what would come next. This incident would not be swept under the rug or dismissed with meaningless apologies. He would ensure that it led to concrete changes in policy, training, and accountability. His mother had often quoted Martin Luther King Jr.'s words about the arc of the moral universe being long but bending toward justice. Today, Terrence was determined to apply whatever pressure he could to that arc, to bend it a little more decidedly toward the justice that remained elusive for too many. The plane began its descent into Reagan National Airport, where Terrence knew Assistant Director Mitchell would be waiting, where statements would be taken and consequences set in motion. The confrontation was over, but the real work of accountability was just beginning. The aircraft's wheels touched down on the runway at Reagan National Airport with a firm jolt, bringing Terrence back to full alertness after his brief immersion in case files. The familiar announcement about remaining seated until the aircraft reached the gate crackled over the intercom, but there was a noticeable tension in Captain Bennett's voice that hadn't been present in his previous communications. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, Terrence glanced out the window and immediately understood the captain's unease. What would normally be an unremarkable arrival gate was transformed into a scene of unusual activity. He could make out multiple news vans with satellite uplinks, camera crews positioning equipment, and a cluster of people in suits who didn't fit the typical pattern of waiting family members or transportation services. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Bennett's voice came over the intercom again, "I've been informed that there are members of the media waiting at our arrival gate. The airline is working to ensure an orderly deplaning process. We ask that you please remain patient as we coordinate with ground staff." Murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers processed this information, many now turning to look at Terrence with renewed interest. The incident had clearly escalated beyond an internal airline matter into a public news story. Terrence's phone buzzed with a message from Assistant Director Lawrence Mitchell, "I'm at the gate with a team. Media presence is significant. How do you want to handle this?" Terrence appreciated Mitchell's approach. Despite outranking him considerably, Mitchell was acknowledging that this was Terrence's experience and giving him agency in determining the response. It was a small but meaningful recognition of dignity that contrasted sharply with the treatment he had received earlier. "Professional and factual," Terrence texted back. "No emotionality. This is about systemic issues, not personal grievance." "Understood," Mitchell replied immediately. "We have a secure path to a private area if you prefer to avoid cameras." Terrence considered this offer briefly before responding, "No. I'll walk out normally. Nothing to hide or avoid." As the aircraft completed its taxi and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Captain Bennett made one final announcement: "We ask that all passengers remain seated momentarily to allow a deplaning coordination with our ground team." This was clearly a pretext to allow Terrence to exit first and deal with the waiting media and officials without the complication of other passengers in the mix. While Terrence appreciated the consideration, he noted the irony that he was once again receiving special treatment, though for very different reasons than the discriminatory treatment earlier. Douglas Freeman approached Terrence's seat, his earlier authoritarianism replaced with deferential caution. "Agent Jackson, we've been instructed to allow you to deplane first if that's your preference." "Thank you," Terrence replied evenly, gathering his briefcase. "And the other involved parties?" "We've been asked to remain on board until statements can be taken," Douglas confirmed, avoiding eye contact. Terrence nodded and stood, straightening his tie and brushing a hand over his suit jacket to smooth any wrinkles. Appearance shouldn't matter, but he knew it did, especially when cameras were waiting. He would represent not just himself but the Bureau, and by extension, all those who had experienced similar treatment without the protection of a badge or the platform of media attention. As he moved toward the exit, Porter called out from his seat, a final desperate attempt at damage control. "Agent Jackson, I truly hope we can resolve this amicably." Terrence paused, turning to face not just Porter but the entire cabin of watching passengers. "Mr. Porter, what happened today wasn't an interpersonal disagreement to be resolved amicably. It was a manifestation of systemic biases that have real consequences for real people every day. Those systems don't change through private apologies or amicable resolutions. They change through accountability, transparency, and structural reform." The cabin remained silent as Terrence turned and continued toward the exit, where Melissa stood with the door now open to the jet bridge. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for flying with us, Agent Jackson." Terrence nodded politely but didn't return the platitude. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he could see Assistant Director Mitchell waiting at the other end, flanked by two other agents in the standard FBI dark suits. Mitchell, a tall, distinguished man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for uncompromising integrity, stepped forward to meet Terrence halfway, extending his hand. "Agent Jackson. I wish we were meeting under different circumstances. Did this incident make you think about how bias affects everyday interactions? Comment number 1 if you've ever witnessed or experienced profiling in public spaces, or number 2 if you believe incidents like this are rare exceptions. Like and subscribe to see how Terrence handles the media firestorm and what happens next with the airline executives. Do you think the airline will face serious consequences, or will they try to sweep this under the rug with a quick settlement? "Thank you for coming personally, sir," Terrence replied, shaking Mitchell's hand firmly. "Director Bennett made it clear this is a priority matter," Mitchell explained as they walked together. "She sends her personal support and expects a full briefing once you've had a chance to provide your statement." As they approached the terminal, the waiting media surged forward, a cacophony of shouted questions and camera flashes creating a wall of sensory assault. Airport security had established a perimeter, but the press presence was substantial enough to make their passage through the terminal a public spectacle regardless. "Agent Jackson. Can you comment on the allegations of racial profiling?" "Sir. Did the airline offer any explanation for their treatment of you?" "Agent Jackson. Will the FBI be filing charges against the security officers?" Mitchell raised a hand to quiet the barrage. "Special Agent Jackson will not be making statements at this time. The FBI takes this incident extremely seriously and is conducting a thorough review. Any official statements will come through proper channels." Terrence maintained his professional composure as they moved through the terminal, neither engaging with nor actively avoiding the cameras. He was aware that his every expression would be analyzed and interpreted, that the cut above his eyebrow, still visible despite Melissa's attempt at first aid, told part of the story that words couldn't fully capture. Waiting near the security checkpoint was another group. Airline executives in corporate attire, their expressions a mixture of concern and calculation. One man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Agent Jackson, I'm Gregory Hammond, CEO of Atlantic Airways. On behalf of our entire company, I want to extend our deepest apologies for your experience today." Terrence accepted the handshake but noted the careful wording, "your experience," rather than "our actions," or "our failure." It was the language of public relations rather than genuine accountability. "Mr. Hammond," Terrence acknowledged. "I appreciate you meeting the flight personally. I assume you're prepared to address this matter substantively, not just symbolically." Hammond's practiced smile faltered slightly. "Of course. We have a conference room secured where we can discuss appropriate next steps privately, away from the media." "I'll need to provide my statement to the FBI first," Terrence replied. "And I should mention that any discussion of next steps should include concrete policy changes regarding profiling and staff training, not just financial considerations." Hammond nodded, though Terrence detected a flicker of surprise, perhaps at the implication that this wouldn't be resolved with a simple settlement check and non-disclosure agreement. As they continued through the terminal, Terrence noticed Officer Wilson and Officer Ramirez being escorted by airport police toward a separate area, presumably for their own statements. Wilson kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone, while Ramirez looked directly at Terrence as they passed, offering a small nod that acknowledged the gravity of the situation. Porter was also being escorted separately, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated as he was led away by airport security. He had attempted to slip away into the crowd of deplaning passengers but had been intercepted as arranged. The media continued to track their progress through the terminal, capturing footage that would soon be broadcast nationwide. Terrence could already see the headlines forming: FBI agent profiled and assaulted, flying while black, federal agent's ordeal, airline faces backlash after racial incident. Mitchell leaned in as they walked. "Your incident has gone viral, Jackson. The videos from the plane hit social media before you even landed. Hashtag flying while black is trending nationwide. Terrence nodded, unsurprised but still processing the implications. What had been a personal humiliation was transforming into a very public conversation about race, authority, and accountability in America. It wasn't a role he had sought, but now that it had found him, he would use the platform responsibly. They were led to a private conference room where 2 more FBI agents waited, along with what appeared to be a bureau attorney. Mitchell made quick introductions before turning to Terrence. "How do you want to proceed, Jackson? This is your call." Terrence appreciated the continued respect for his agency in the process. "By the book," he replied. "Full statements, proper documentation, and transparency throughout. This needs to be handled not as a PR issue but as what it is. A civil rights matter with potential criminal elements regarding the use of excessive force." Mitchell nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. We'll take your statement first, then coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding potential charges. Director Bennett has already spoken with the Attorney General, who's taking a personal interest." The high-level attention underscored the seriousness with which this was being treated, not just as an isolated incident but as a symptom of broader issues that demanded federal scrutiny. As Terrence took a seat to begin his formal statement, he was struck by the contrast between the deference and attention he was receiving now versus the dismissal and aggression he had faced on the aircraft. The badge that had been ignored when he tried to identify himself was now opening doors and commanding respect. The irony wasn't lost on him, nor was the sobering reality that most people who experienced similar profiling lacked the protection and platform his position afforded him. If his experience could help shine a light on those everyday injustices, perhaps some greater good could come from what had been a deeply personal violation. With that thought in mind, Terrence began his statement, methodically recounting the events with the same attention to detail that had made him an excellent FBI agent. This was no longer just about his dignity or his rights. It was about using his voice for those whose experiences of injustice went unheard and unaddressed. Outside the conference room, the media waited, cameras ready to broadcast his story to millions. The personal had become political, the individual had become representative, and a routine flight had transformed into a national conversation about who is presumed innocent or suspicious based solely on the color of their skin. The conference room on the secure side of Reagan National Airport had transformed into an impromptu command center. 3 hours had passed since Terrence's plane had landed, and the initial statement-taking had evolved into a multi-pronged investigation. FBI agents moved with purpose, airport security officials conferred in corners, and airline representatives hovered anxiously, their corporate damage control strategies visibly crumbling as the severity of the situation became increasingly apparent. Terrence sat at the head of the conference table, reviewing security footage that had been pulled from the aircraft. The cameras had captured everything. His calm compliance, Porter's aggressive complaints, the crew's selective enforcement, and most damning of all, Wilson's unnecessary use of force that had resulted in Terrence's facial injury. "The footage corroborates your statement completely," Assistant Director Mitchell confirmed, standing behind Terrence as they watched the silent video play out on a laptop. "There was no justification for the escalation to physical force, especially given your repeated attempts to identify yourself." Terrence nodded, watching the scene with professional detachment despite being the central figure in the footage. "What about the pre-boarding interactions? Anything there?" Mitchell tapped a key, switching to footage from the gate area. "This is interesting. Watch Porter here." The footage showed Porter arriving at the gate and immediately engaging in conversation with Douglas Freeman, the head flight attendant. They appeared familiar with each other, exchanging what looked like more than casual pleasantries before Porter boarded the aircraft. They knew each other, Terrence observed. That explains why Freeman was so quick to accept Porter's version of events without question. "There's more," Mitchell added, advancing the footage. "Here's Melissa Weber, the flight attendant, joining their conversation briefly before boarding. We're running background checks on all 3 now." The discovery added another dimension to what had initially appeared to be spontaneous discrimination. The possibility of a coordinated effort raised even more serious concerns. The conference room door opened, and Gregory Hammond, the airline CEO, entered with a woman in a sharp suit who was immediately identifiable as corporate legal counsel. "Agent Jackson," Hammond began, his tone carefully modulated to project concern without admitting liability. "I've just finished reviewing the preliminary reports. I want to reiterate our deepest apologies and assure you that Atlantic Airways is prepared to make this right." Terrence regarded Hammond steadily. "Define, make this right, Mr. Hammond." Hammond glanced at his attorney before responding. "We're prepared to offer a substantial settlement, of course. Full compensation for any medical expenses, additional damages for the emotional distress, first-class travel privileges for life." "I'm not interested in free tickets or hush money," Terrence interrupted calmly. "What I'm interested in is substantive change that ensures this doesn't happen to anyone else." Hammond seemed momentarily thrown by this response. In his experience, most incidents, even serious ones, could be resolved with sufficient financial compensation and the right confidentiality agreements. "Of course, we're also committed to reviewing our policies," Hammond began. "Not reviewing. Transforming," Terrence corrected. "What happened today wasn't a failure to follow existing policies. It was the predictable outcome of policies and training that enable profiling in selective enforcement." The attorney leaned forward. "Mr. Jackson, Special Agent Jackson," Mitchell corrected firmly. "Special Agent Jackson," she amended smoothly. "While Atlantic Airways acknowledges that today's incident was deeply regrettable, we need to be careful about characterizing it as systemic without a comprehensive review." Terrence raised an eyebrow. "I believe the footage we've just reviewed, along with the emerging evidence of prior coordination between your staff and Mr. Porter, speaks for itself. But if you'd prefer to have this conversation in a more public forum, perhaps with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division present, that can be arranged." The implied threat of federal civil rights charges shifted the atmosphere in the room immediately. Hammond and his attorney exchanged alarmed glances. "That won't be necessary," Hammond replied quickly. "We're fully committed to cooperation and meaningful reform." "What specifically did you have in mind?" Before Terrence could respond, an FBI analyst entered the room and handed Mitchell a folder. The assistant director reviewed its contents quickly, his expression hardening. "It seems we have more context for Mr. Porter's behavior," Mitchell announced. "Calvin Porter has been the subject of 3 separate complaints of racial discrimination at his investment firm, Morrison Capital. 2 were settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. The 3rd is pending." Terrence absorbed this information with grim vindication. Porter's behavior on the plane hadn't been an isolated incident of discomfort or misunderstanding, it was part of a pattern. "There's something else," Mitchell continued. "Morrison Capital has a connection to Atlantic Airways. They manage a significant portion of the airline's pension fund investments." Hammond's face paled visibly. "I was unaware of any personal connection between Mr. Porter and our staff members." "Were you also unaware that your company's financial relationship with Morrison Capital might create an environment where your employees feel pressured to accommodate even the inappropriate demands of someone like Porter?" Terrence asked pointedly. Before Hammond could formulate a response, the door opened again. This time, Agent Sarah Rodriguez entered, nodding briefly to Terrence before addressing Mitchell directly. "Sir, we've completed the preliminary background check on Porter, and there's something you need to see immediately." She handed Mitchell a tablet, which he reviewed with increasing concern before passing it to Terrence. The screen displayed financial records from Morrison Capital, highlighting a series of transactions that immediately caught Terrence's trained eye. "These are consistent with money laundering patterns," Terrence observed, scrolling through the data. "And these destinations match our watch list for domestic extremist funding." "The Highland case," Sarah confirmed. "Porter's firm appears to be one of the financial conduits we've been tracking." The revelation landed like a thunderbolt in the room. What had begun as an incident of discrimination on an aircraft was potentially connected to the very terrorism financing case Terrence had been rushing back to Washington to work on. Hammond and his attorney exchanged confused glances, clearly lost as the conversation had shifted to matters beyond their knowledge or concern. "Mr. Hammond," Mitchell addressed the airline CEO, "I think we need to continue this conversation about your corporate response to today's incident separately. Agent Rodriguez, please escort Mr. Hammond and his counsel to the adjacent conference room where they can wait comfortably." Once Hammond had been ushered out, Mitchell turned to Terrence. "This is developing into something much bigger than an airline incident, Jackson." Porter recognized me, Terrence realized aloud. That's why he was so uncomfortable and tried to change seats immediately. He wasn't just a random bigot, he knew exactly who I was. Sarah nodded. "We found surveillance photos of our team in files recovered from a related case last month. Your face would have been known to someone involved in Highland." So Porter's attempt to have me removed from the flight wasn't just about racial discomfort, Terrence continued, the pieces falling into place. It was an intentional effort to prevent me from reaching Washington for the briefing. He used racial profiling as a tool, knowing how the system would respond. And he had help, Mitchell added grimly. Freeman and Weber's involvement takes on a new dimension if they were knowingly assisting in obstructing a federal agent. The implications were staggering. What had appeared to be merely a case of racial profiling, already serious enough, was potentially part of a coordinated attempt to interfere with a federal investigation into domestic terrorism financing. "We need to bring Porter in for questioning immediately," Terrence stated. "And we need to revisit the security footage with this new context in mind." Mitchell was already on his phone, issuing directives to have Porter detained for formal questioning. Sarah sat down next to Terrence, pulling out her laptop to access the Highland case files. "I can't believe he was right there, sitting next to you," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Talk about hiding in plain sight. He wasn't expecting me on that flight," Terrence reasoned. "I changed my return plans at the last minute because of my mother's funeral. My original booking would have been on tomorrow's flight. So when he saw you board, he panicked and tried to create a distraction," Sarah concluded. "And when that didn't work, he escalated to having you removed entirely." The door opened again, and an agent informed them that Porter was now in a secure interrogation room, demanding a lawyer. "Let him stew for a bit," Mitchell decided. "We need to get our ducks in a row before questioning begins." Terrence's phone buzzed with a news alert. The incident on the plane had exploded across all major networks. Social media was ablaze with the hashtag FBI profiled, and Atlantic Airways stock had plummeted nearly 15% in the hours since the videos had gone viral. A movement had already sprung up online calling for boycotts of the airline. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Politicians were weighing in. What had happened to Terrence had struck a chord that resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of his case. Mitchell noticed Terrence reviewing the news. "This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller, Jackson. How do you want to handle the public side of this?" Terrence considered the question carefully. "Professionally and factually. No personal crusade, no emotional appeals. The facts speak for themselves, and the connection to Highland adds a dimension that requires careful handling." Mitchell nodded approvingly. Director Bennett suggested the same approach. "She's prepared to make a public statement supporting you fully while emphasizing the broader law enforcement concerns." As they continued developing their investigative strategy, word came that Douglas Freeman and Melissa Weber had been terminated by Atlantic Airways, pending further investigation. Wilson had been suspended without pay, while Ramirez had been placed on administrative duty, a reflection of his attempts, however insufficient, to de-escalate the situation. The airline's attempts at damage control were in full swing, with a hastily released statement pledging a complete overhaul of training protocols and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. But the corporate platitudes rang hollow against the backdrop of the visceral footage still circulating online. For Terrence, the personal humiliation he had experienced was now contextualized within a much larger framework. His individual dignity remained important, but the case had expanded to encompass national security concerns, corporate accountability, and a public reckoning with the realities of racial bias in everyday interactions. As he prepared to face Porter in the interrogation room, Terrence reflected on how his mother would view these developments. She had always taught him that individual dignity was connected to collective justice, that standing up for yourself meant creating space for others to stand as well. Today's events, painful as they were, might create that space in ways he couldn't have anticipated when he boarded his flight in Atlanta just hours earlier. The interrogation room at FBI headquarters presented a stark contrast to the chaos of the airport. Here, everything was controlled, measured, and designed to elicit truth from even the most reluctant subjects. Calvin Porter sat alone at the metal table, his expensive suit now rumpled, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible anxiety as he waited. When the door finally opened, Porter straightened, expecting his attorney. Instead, he found himself face to face with Terrence Jackson. The same man he had tried so desperately to have removed from the flight. The color drained from Porter's face as Terrence entered, followed by Sarah Rodriguez. "Mr. Porter," Terrence began professionally, placing a folder on the table as he took a seat across from the investment banker. "I believe we have some unfinished business. My attorney should be present for any questioning," Porter responded immediately, his voice lacking the confidence it had projected on the aircraft. "Your attorney has been delayed in traffic," Terrence replied calmly. "But we're not quite at the questioning stage yet. Right now, I'm simply introducing myself properly, something I wasn't allowed to do earlier today." Terrence opened his credentials, placing them on the table. "Special Agent Terrence Jackson, FBI Counterterrorism Division. And this is my partner, Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez." Porter swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the agents. "Look, what happened on the plane was unfortunate, but it was a misunderstanding that got out of hand. I've already spoken to the airline about. We're not here to discuss the airline incident in isolation, Mr. Porter," Terrence interrupted smoothly. "Though I must say, your reaction upon seeing me board that flight was quite revealing in retrospect." "I don't know what you mean," Porter replied, but a bead of sweat had formed on his temple. Sarah opened her laptop, turning the screen to face Porter. "These are surveillance photos recovered from a raid on a property in Norfolk last month. Notice anything interesting?" The screen displayed grainy images of FBI agents, including Terrence, entering a federal building. The photos had clearly been taken from a distance, using telephoto lenses, the kind of surveillance typically associated with hostile intelligence gathering. "I've never seen those before," Porter insisted, but his eyes lingered on the images a moment too long. "That's odd," Terrence commented, "because digital forensics has traced these particular images to an encrypted email account registered to Morrison Capital. Your company, Mr. Porter." Porter's attorney would have advised him to remain silent at this point, but the lawyer's absence and Porter's growing panic created an opening that the experienced FBI agents were well trained to exploit. "Those must have been sent to us by a client," Porter attempted. "We manage investments for hundreds of individuals and organizations. Including Highland Strategic Partners?" Sarah asked, referring to the front company they had been investigating for domestic terrorism financing. The name hit Porter like a physical blow. His composure cracked visibly as he realized the extent of what the FBI knew. "I want my attorney," he stated firmly. "Of course," Terrence agreed. "And you'll have one present before formal questioning begins. But while we wait, perhaps you'd like to consider your position. We've already frozen the accounts connected to Highland. We have the surveillance photos. And now, thanks to your actions on the flight today, we have evidence of your attempt to interfere with a federal investigation by preventing a key investigator from reaching a critical briefing." Porter's eyes widened. "That's not what?" "Racial profiling as a cover for obstruction of justice," Terrence continued, his voice remaining professional despite the personal nature of the offense. "It's an interesting strategy, Mr. Porter. Using societal biases as a tool to further your criminal enterprise. You can't prove any of that, Porter insisted, though his confident facade was crumbling rapidly. Actually, we can, Sarah interjected, pulling up another file on her laptop. Your phone records show multiple calls to Douglas Freeman in the days leading up to today's flight. Care to explain why you were in regular contact with the head flight attendant on an aircraft you supposedly boarded as a routine passenger? Porter's legal training finally kicked in, overriding his panic. I'm not saying another word without my attorney present. That's your right, Terrence acknowledged, closing his folder. But consider this, Mr. Porter. We already have enough to charge you with financial crimes related to Highland. The obstruction angle is just additional leverage. Depending on what we learn about your level of knowledge regarding Highland's activities, you could be looking at material support for terrorism charges. The words landed with devastating impact. Porter's face, already pale, now took on an almost greenish tint. Terrorism, he whispered, the word catching in his throat. What did you think Highland Strategic Partners was funding with the money you helped launder? Sarah asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity. Community centers. Charitable foundations. The door opened, and Assistant Director Mitchell entered along with a Justice Department attorney. Mr. Porter's lawyer has arrived and is being processed through security, Mitchell informed them. We have about 5 minutes. Perfect timing, Terrence replied, standing up. Mr. Porter was just processing the seriousness of his situation. Mitchell placed a new folder on the table. We've completed an initial analysis of the financial records from Morrison Capital. The pattern is clear, Porter. Money moving through shell companies in Wyoming, Nevada, and Delaware, eventually reaching Highland, which then distributed funds to at least 7 known domestic extremist groups. Porter's breathing had become shallow, the reality of his circumstances finally penetrating his entitled worldview. I didn't know, he managed. I just handled the transactions. I didn't ask questions about where the money was going. Willful blindness isn't a defense in terrorism financing cases, the Justice Department attorney noted. But cooperation can be taken into consideration during charging and sentencing. Porter looked up, a glimmer of hope in his expression. Cooperation. Full disclosure of all Highland-related activities, Mitchell specified. Names, dates, accounts, everything you know about their operations and personnel. And a complete admission of your actions today regarding Agent Jackson, Terrence added. Including any coordination with airline staff. Porter looked between the FBI agents, calculating his options rapidly. If I cooperate, what kind of deal could I get? That depends entirely on the value of your information, the Justice Department attorney replied. But refusing to cooperate guarantees the maximum charges. The interrogation room fell silent as Porter absorbed the gravity of his situation. The entitlement and arrogance that had led him to believe he could have a federal agent removed from a flight simply because of his race had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of his legal predicament. Freeman is my cousin's husband, Porter finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. When I saw Agent Jackson board, I recognized him from the surveillance photos Highland had circulated to key financial partners. I was told to watch for FBI personnel involved in their investigation and report any sightings. I didn't know why, I swear. So you called Freeman and coordinated to have me removed from the flight, Terrence stated. Porter nodded miserably. I told him you were on an FBI watch list, potentially dangerous. He agreed to find a reason to have you removed. Weber was brought into it once I was on board. And the false claims about threats I supposedly made? Terrence pressed. I panicked, Porter admitted. When you started making calls, I was afraid you were onto me somehow. I didn't think they'd get physical with you. I just wanted you off the flight. The door opened again, and an agent informed them that Porter's attorney had arrived. Mitchell nodded to Terrence and Sarah, indicating it was time to step out. As they left the interrogation room, Mitchell spoke quietly. He'll crack completely once his lawyer understands what we have. Classic white-collar criminal, fold at the first sign of serious consequences. His information could break open the entire Highland network, Sarah noted. We've been trying to map their financial structure for months. All because he couldn't stand sitting next to a black man in first class, Terrence observed, the irony not lost on any of them. Back in the command center, the investigation had expanded significantly. What had begun as a racial profiling incident on an aircraft had evolved into a major counterterrorism case, with agents now tracking financial records, communication patterns, and potential connections between Highland strategic partners and known extremist groups. Agent Alicia Bennett, the newest member of their team, approached with a tablet displaying a complex network diagram. "Sir, we've been mapping Porter's contacts based on his phone and email records. There's something you should see." The diagram showed Porter at the center of a web that extended to multiple airline employees beyond Freeman and Weber, suggesting a more extensive network of contacts potentially involved in surveillance of federal agents. They were using the airlines as an intelligence-gathering operation, Terrence realized. Flight manifests, travel patterns, conversations overheard by crew members, it's an ideal setup for tracking federal employee movements. And all hidden behind the plausible deniability of routine discrimination, Sarah added grimly. If you had complained about your treatment without the dramatic badge reveal, it would have been written off as just another incident of flying while black, regrettable but not investigated as part of a larger conspiracy. Mitchell studied the diagram with growing concern. We need to expand this investigation to all airlines where Porter has connections. If they've infiltrated one carrier, they've likely done the same with others. As the team mobilized to pursue this new angle, Terrence found himself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had connected his personal experience of discrimination to a major counterterrorism breakthrough. His mother had always told him that justice works in unexpected ways, that standing up for your own dignity could create ripples affecting many others. In a conference room nearby, Porter was now cooperating fully, his attorney having advised him that his best option was to provide complete information in exchange for consideration during charging and sentencing. The information flowing from that interview was already generating new leads and connections, potentially preventing planned attacks before they could occur. Terrence's phone buzzed with a text from his father, "Saw you on the news. Your mother would be proud. You held your dignity and found justice in the process." The message brought a momentary tightness to Terrence's throat. He had boarded that flight grieving his mother, and in the face of discrimination, he had channeled her teachings about dignity and perseverance. Now, those same principles had led to a breakthrough that might save lives. Sometimes, justice arrived through unexpected channels. Today, it had arrived because Terrence Jackson had refused to be less than who he was. A dedicated FBI agent who happened to be a black man, whose dignity was inherent rather than conferred by a badge. As the investigation continued to unfold around him, Terrence took a moment to text his father back, "She taught me well. Dignity can't be taken, only surrendered." 6 months had passed since the fateful flight that transformed a routine case of racial profiling into a major counterterrorism breakthrough. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. buzzed with activity as reporters gathered for the sentencing of Calvin Porter and his co-conspirators in what had become known as the Highland case. Terrence Jackson, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit with a blue tie, walked confidently through the security checkpoint, nodding to the officers who now recognized him instantly, not from the viral videos of his mistreatment, but from his subsequent work in bringing down one of the most sophisticated domestic terrorism financing networks in recent history. Sarah Rodriguez waited for him at the courthouse steps, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal concern. "Ready for this? It's going to be a media circus." "I've gotten used to cameras," Terrence replied with a slight smile. "Though I still prefer working behind the scenes." That option had disappeared the moment his FBI badge had clattered to the floor of that Atlantic Airways flight. The incident had catapulted him into the public eye, making him a reluctant symbol in ongoing national conversations about racial profiling, law enforcement accountability, and the insidious ways bias could be weaponized. Inside the courtroom, Porter sat at the defendant's table alongside 3 other executives from Morrison Capital who had been implicated in the Highland financing scheme. Their expensive suits couldn't mask their defeated postures. Men accustomed to wielding power now facing the consequences of their actions. Porter glanced up as Terrence entered, their eyes meeting briefly before Porter looked away, unable to maintain contact. His cooperation had been complete once he understood the severity of the charges he faced, providing information that led to the identification of 17 domestic terrorism plots in various stages of planning. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Porter's sentencing came first, given his central role in both the financial crimes and the attempt to obstruct justice by having Terrence removed from the flight. "Mr. Porter," the judge addressed him directly, "your actions represent a betrayal on multiple levels. You betrayed your country by facilitating the funding of groups dedicated to violent extremism. You betrayed your professional obligations by using your financial expertise to conceal illegal transactions. And perhaps most disturbingly, you weaponized societal prejudice as a tool to further your criminal enterprise, attempting to use racial profiling to prevent a federal agent from performing his duties." Porter stared at the floor as the judge continued. "While the court acknowledges your eventual cooperation, we cannot ignore the gravity of your offenses. You are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release." The sentence was significant, reflecting the seriousness with which the justice system had treated the case. As Porter was led away, Terrence felt no personal satisfaction, only a professional recognition that accountability had been served. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for statements. Terrence provided brief, factual comments about the case while deflecting questions about his personal experiences. His focus remained on the broader implications rather than individual vindication. Later that afternoon, Terrence found himself in a very different setting, the corporate headquarters of Atlantic Airways, where he was consulting on the implementation of a comprehensive anti-bias training program that had emerged from the settlement of his case against the airline. Gregory Hammond, the CEO who had initially offered Terrence hush money and free flights, now treated him with genuine respect rather than damage control deference. The airline had learned an expensive lesson, with the incident costing them millions in lost revenue and a 15% sustained drop in stock value. "The first group of trainers has completed certification," Hammond reported as they reviewed the program's progress. "Every employee, from executives to ground staff, will complete the full 40-hour training by year's end." "And the Independent Oversight Committee?" Terrence inquired. "Fully operational, with direct reporting lines to the board of directors," Hammond confirmed. "We've included civil rights attorneys, diversity specialists, and most importantly, community representatives with lived experience of discrimination in travel contexts." What Hammond didn't volunteer, but Terrence knew from internal reports, was that Atlantic Airways had initially resisted such sweeping changes. Only when faced with potential civil rights charges and devastating publicity had they embraced reform as their only viable path forward. The outcome wasn't perfect, systemic change rarely was, but it represented meaningful progress. The training program Terrence had helped design wasn't just sensitivity theater. It included concrete protocols for challenging biased reporting from passengers, ensuring consistent application of rules regardless of passengers' appearance, and creating accountability mechanisms with real consequences for discriminatory actions. Brady Wilson, the security officer who had assaulted Terrence, had faced charges for excessive use of force. His trial was scheduled for the following month, with Officer Ramirez prepared to testify against him regarding the unnecessary escalation and failure to verify Terrence's identity claims. Melissa Weber and Douglas Freeman, the flight attendants who had participated in the discrimination, had both been terminated immediately after the incident. As part of the settlement agreement, they were required to complete extensive community service with civil rights organizations focused on transportation equity. More importantly, they had issued public apologies that acknowledged not just their actions but the underlying biases that had driven them, a rare moment of genuine accountability in an environment where corporate apologies typically avoided admitting substantive wrongdoing. After concluding his consultation at Atlantic Airways, Terrence headed to his final appointment of the day, a meeting at the White House, where the president would be recognizing the team responsible for dismantling the Highland network. What had begun with Terrence's profiling on an airplane had ultimately led to the prevention of multiple attacks and the arrest of dozens of domestic terrorists. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with the president specifically acknowledging how Terrence's personal experience of discrimination had paradoxically created the opportunity to uncover a major terrorist financing operation. Special Agent Jackson's dignity under pressure not only demonstrated his exceptional character, the president noted, but also revealed how bias can be exploited by those who wish our country harm. His experience reminds us that civil rights aren't just a moral imperative, they're a national security priority. The recognition was gratifying, but even more meaningful to Terrence was the program he had established with the settlement funds from Atlantic Airways, a scholarship fund for minority students entering law enforcement, designed to create a pipeline of diverse professionals who could change these systems from within. The first cohort of 20 scholars had begun their training at universities across the country, each committed to bringing their perspectives and experiences to institutions that had historically excluded people who looked like them. Over the following weeks, Terrence made appearances on several national talk shows, using the platform not to focus on his personal experience but to elevate the conversation about systemic bias and its real-world consequences. He spoke thoughtfully about the intersection of race, authority, and accountability, always emphasizing solutions rather than simply highlighting problems. Within the FBI, his experience had prompted a bureau-wide review of protocols for agent identification and travel. New systems were implemented to ensure that agents could securely verify their credentials in challenging situations, preventing similar incidents in the future. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome for Terrence personally came 6 months to the day after the incident, when he boarded another Atlantic Airways flight, this time with a very different reception. Special Agent Jackson, the lead flight attendant, greeted him with genuine respect rather than the performative deference that had followed his badge reveal months earlier. "Thank you for your continued guidance on our training program. Your insights have been invaluable." Terrence nodded appreciatively as he made his way to his seat, noticing the subtle but significant changes in how the crew interacted with all passengers, the consistency of their greetings, the absence of the selective enforcement he had witnessed before. As the flight took off, Terrence gazed out the window at the Washington landscape receding below, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. His mother's funeral had led to a flight that had led to humiliation that had led to a major case breakthrough that had led to systemic reforms that might prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. Justice often arrived through winding paths. Progress rarely followed a straight line. But dignity, the dignity his parents had instilled in him from childhood, remained the constant that had guided him through each challenging moment. The changes implemented at Atlantic Airways wouldn't eliminate racism or bias from society. The reforms within law enforcement wouldn't prevent every instance of profiling or excessive force. But each step toward accountability created space for the next step, and the next, in the long journey toward the justice his mother had always believed in. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Terrence closed his eyes briefly, imagining his mother's proud smile. "Dignity can't be taken," he whispered to himself, "only surrendered." And he had not surrendered his. Terrence Jackson's story powerfully illustrates how dignity becomes the ultimate weapon against discrimination. When faced with blatant racism, Terrence maintained his composure and professionalism, refusing to surrender his inherent worth despite humiliation and physical harm. His experience demonstrates how prejudice operates not just through individual actions but through systems that enable, excuse, and amplify bias. The story also reveals how seemingly isolated incidents of discrimination often connect to larger patterns of injustice. What began as typical racial profiling unexpectedly uncovered a terrorist financing network, showing how bias creates vulnerabilities that threaten everyone's security. Perhaps most importantly, Terrence's response teaches us that true accountability isn't about revenge or simple punishment, it's about creating lasting change. By rejecting a quick settlement in favor of comprehensive reforms, Terrence transformed his personal injustice into institutional improvement that would protect countless others. His mother's wisdom that dignity can't be taken, only surrendered, became both his shield and his guide. By standing firm in his truth while pursuing justice through proper channels, Terrence demonstrated how maintaining one's dignity can ultimately lead to transformation far beyond personal vindication. What moments in your life have tested your dignity? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wondered how you would respond? Comment below sharing your thoughts on Terrence's approach to injustice. If this story moved you, please like the video to help it reach more viewers. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of courage in the face of discrimination. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that dignity is never determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond when faced with injustice. Thank you for joining us on Terrence's journey from humiliation to transformation.